Welcome to the last talk of this session, which will be program equivalence in sequential core Erlang by Peter Beretsky and Daniel Horpakci.
Thank you for the introductions. And I think let's play the pre-recorded talk.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome, I'm Peter Beretsky, and our paper is about defining program equivalence relations in a sequential subset of core Erlang. The motivation behind this research is to reason about refactoring correctness. Note that a refactoring is such a program code transformation which preserves the behavior. For example, if I take the Erlang module or function E and transform it to E prime, then I have to argue about the equivalence between E and E prime. That is, E and E prime behaves the same way. This is a good example for the refactoring instance verification, but we are more interested in verifying the refactoring definition. That is, if we apply a verified refactoring definition to a concrete program, then we also get a proof that the concrete and the refactored program behaves the same way. For example, here is a very simple refactoring. Naturally, it's correct when we can prove the equivalence between these expressions. Note that these expressions already contain some meta variables like this E, which can be any expression, but usually when we apply such a rewrite rule, basically, this is a rewrite rule, we do it inside an expression context, which leads us to the notion of contextual equivalence. Generally speaking, a rewrite rule can be considered as a refactoring if we can prove the contextual equivalence between the left and the right hand side. Naturally, these terms on the left and right hand side could be first order terms, that is, they can contain meta variables or expression patterns. Moreover, we can also make some side conditions which needs to be proven when we apply the refactoring to concrete programs, but we can use them as hypotheses when we verify the refactoring definition. Naturally, most refactorings are non-local refactorings, extensive refactorings, but these could be decomposed into such equivalence formulas. So all in all, the refactoring correctness highly depends on what we call equivalence and contextual equivalence. Now, there are a number of approaches to define program equivalence, like using logical relations and contextual equivalence, or using bisimulations, or there are some algorithm-based approaches, or the K-framework, or using matching logic or other dedicated logic. In this presentation, I will focus on the logical relations. But let's see how we reach the conclusions that for core Erlang, we need logical relations. First, we try to define simple behavioral equivalence. Based on the Software Foundation's book, we can define a simple behavioral equivalence with preorders, and equivalence is basically preorder from E1 to E2 and backwards. And equivalence means that when we evaluate the first expression and get the result V, then that implies the second expression will also be evaluated to the same value. Now, what's the problem with this definition? If E1 and E2 are function expressions, naturally, these function expressions evaluate to closure values, and as you can see, these closures are not equal syntactically. However, they behave the same way when we apply them to the same number parameter. So that leads us to the thought we should consider function context or application context in this case, because these functions, these closures behave the same way in the same application context. So let's try to define a contextual equivalence or a contextual preorder first. Note that under context we mean a special expression which has a hole in it. Basically, one of its sub-expression has been replaced by a hole, and this hole can be substituted by any expression. And two expressions are contextually equivalent when in every such context, when we put E1 into this hole and E2, we will get the same results. Now, what's the problem with this definition? The previous problem was not solved because we have to prove the equality of the results for every context, such as the whole itself. Moreover, there is a bigger problem. If we want to prove these two expressions contextually equivalent, then we have to prove again for every context, such as this function context too. But if we substitute the whole with these two expressions, then we basically get the same problem as before. So we haven't solved this yet. So somehow the result equivalence concept should be introduced instead of equality. That leads us to the logical relations. Our work is mainly an adaptation of the work of Pitts, and it's highly based on the work of Culpeper and Cobb from the technical point of view, because it's formalized in the Coq proof assistant. First, we chose a restricted language, a simple subset of core Erlang, to investigate these approaches on. This language supports variables, literals, integers as literals, variables, functions, recursive functions, function applications, let and letrec expressions, moreover, simple conditional expressions and addition to be able to write meaningful programs. The challenges with this language is, first, it's a dynamically typed language, so we cannot use the type system to define recursive functions and use induction. And from the technical point of view, there is no partial function application, so every time we apply a function, we have to use explicitly a parameter list, a list of expressions. The first problem is solved halfly by variable scoping, that is logging which are the free variables of an expression. And when there are no free variables in an expression, then the expression can be considered as a closed expression. While the other challenge can be solved with additional helper lemmas about evaluating a list of expressions. Moreover, in Coq, handwritten induction schemes can be also used. For this language, we have developed the frame stack semantics, which is a very similar semantics to the reduction style semantics, but the reduction contexts are decomposed into basic evaluation contexts. These are the so-called frames. Every frame contains a whole, and we will put back into this frame when we have evaluated an expression in the regex position and continue the evaluation. Moreover, the semantics can be defined by case analysis on the evaluable expression and the frames or frame stack. If the frame stack is just a list of frames. And we can also define the termination relation directly in an inductive way. Moreover, we also can use step indexing, as you can see in these derivation rules. But why is this good? According to Pitts, and we have also started to prove this lemma, that proving the termination of expressions in every expression syntactic context, we can also derive that these expressions were equivalent and their result was also equivalent. So this is a work in progress currently, but we have a proof sketch already. Now, after defining this termination relation, we can define the logical relations, first for closed expressions and closed frame stacks. Two expressions are related by n steps when the termination of the first one in m steps implies the termination of the second one in some steps. Note that m is less or equal than n, and naturally these terminations should happen in related frame stacks. And this property should hold for all m that is less or equal than n. The related frame stacks are very similar. In this case, the only difference is that in the regex position we put related values. Now, what does it mean to have related values? Let's see this more in detail. Two literals are related when they are equal. Variables and function identifiers shouldn't be considered because they are not closed expressions or closed values. But when should we consider two functions related? Now, this thought can help us when we are defining it. So if we have equivalent, or let's say related parameters and equivalent functions, then when we apply the equivalent functions to equivalent parameters, we should get equivalent results. So in this case, we have related parameters, and we do the beta reduction of the body of the function. So we substitute the variables of the function with the related values, and we should get related expressions. The same chain of thought applies for the recursive case, for recursive functions, but in this case we need an additional substitution. The function's name or identifier should be substituted by the function definition itself. We have also proven these very simple functions related by this relation, logical relation. But now we can extend these relations for closed terms to open expressions and values. But first we need to define what is a substitution. That is a function which maps the free variables of an expression to closed values. This is what is called a closing substitution. And we can also define a logical relation for substitutions. Two substitutions are related when they assign the variables in a domain. So they assign related closed values to variables and function identifiers. And using this notion, we can define the logical relation for open expressions and values. If we take related closing substitutions, substitute these open values with these, and then what we get should be related by the closed value or expression relation. Here is a very simple example what can be proven to be related with this relation. After defining the open version of these relations, we also prove some properties. The most important one is the fundamental property, so-called fundamental property, which is a form of reflexivity, and the compatibility lemmas, which are forms of congruence, basically. Like if we check this one for the addition, if the smaller sub-expressions are related, then the bigger addition expression is also related. In this case, especially the proof for the recursive functions was challenging because it involved induction, but most of the proofs only involved the unfolding of these premises, these relations in the premises, and making some derivation steps in the semantics and applying these smaller premises to the intermediate configurations. And the fundamental property is basically a corollary of the compatibility lemmas. Naturally, we have also proven other lemmas, like I mentioned before, for the list evaluation. So logical relations are a useful tool to reason about the properties of these relations, but naturally, in the end, we want to prove these logical relations to be equal to the contextual preorder. But let's see first another preorder relation, another equivalence relation, which is called the closed instances of use. So for closed expression, that means the termination of the first expression implies the termination of the second one in the same frame stack. Naturally, this can be extended by closing substitutions. So if C assigns the free variables of E1 and E2 to closed values, then these should be in the closed CIU relation, preorder relation. It's simpler than the logical relation because there is only one substitution and one frame stack and not two related ones. That's why it is more suitable usually to reason about correct, concrete program equivalences than the logical relations. After defining this preorder, we have also proved that it is equal to the open version of the logical relation for expressions, which involved the use of the fundamental property and the form of transitivity between the CIU preorder and this logical relation. Now we can also define contextual equivalence. We followed the idea by Culpeper and Cobb. So contextual preorder is the largest family of indexed relations which satisfy some criteria. First is the adequacy. This index is used to log what are the free variables of the expressions, the common free variables. So if both expressions are closed, then the termination of the first one implies the termination of the second one if they are related. Moreover, transitive and reflexivity should hold for all set of variables and function identifiers gamma. And also the compatibility rules should hold, which I have already shown in context of the logical relations. When we think of contextual equivalence, we think of some notion like this, and this definition of contextual equivalence also satisfies these criteria. So let's see what does it say. We have two expressions which contain only the variables, free variables in gamma, and we have a context which closes these variables, so it assigns some expressions to them. And when we put E1 and E2 inside such context, then the termination of the first one in the empty frame stack should imply the termination of the second one. So this is the notion of a concrete contextual equivalence. We have proven that the CIU equivalence, and naturally the logical relations, because those are equal. So the CIU equivalence of expression implies the contextual preorder of these same expressions, and we are currently working on the other direction. So two expressions being in the contextual preorder implies that they are also in the CIU preorder. And as I mentioned before, we have also created a Coq embedding, so all of the results are formalized in Coq, and it's open source. You can reach it under this link. And as I mentioned, there were some technical challenges like the capture avoidance. So we used a nameless representation because the named variable representation used to be problematic with the fresh name generation especially, and also the applications because it involved to reason about a list of expressions which involves sometimes mutual induction and a lot of additional lemmas. Moreover, handwritten induction schemes, derived induction schemes for the expression type itself. All in all, we have detailed why simple behavioral equivalence and naive contextual equivalence is not sufficient to verify refactorings. And we have put effort to formalize a proper notion of contextual equivalence. We have formalized 3 different equivalences and currently working on the proof of equality between these equivalences. Contextual equivalence is the equivalence we want to prove because we want to apply the refactorings locally so that we can use the contextual equivalence for this purpose. The logical relations are suitable to prove properties of these 3 relations, and the CIU equivalence is suitable to prove concrete terms equivalent because it's simpler than the logical relations and does not involve induction like in case of contextual equivalence. And we have also created an open source scope formalization. Naturally, in the short-term future, we are planning on finishing these equality proofs and formalizing also the proof for the termination implying equivalence in case of the contextual equivalence according to Pitt's idea. And naturally, it's also a very short-term plan to prove more concrete expression patterns equivalence. In the medium term, we are planning on formalizing concurrent core Erlang and also simple refactorings and prove them correct, while in the long term, entire Erlang formalization is the goal, and also the investigation of bisimulation approaches to define such equivalences. So if you are interested, feel free to contact us, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the talk. While we wait for more questions, I have a couple of them because I have worked in core Erlang and we never found a formal definition of the translation from Erlang to core Erlang. I don't know if you have some hints about this.
That's a very good question. Thank you for that. Actually, we only investigated core Erlang up to now, and usually when we used Erlang code for some purposes like validating the semantics, we assume that the translation could be trusted, but haven't investigated its correctness yet.
Mm-hmm. And it seems
also,
that sorry.
It's also a swampy area today because if I know it right, Erlang has no strict language specification document. So the question is, what is the formal semantics of the translation and so what defines the formal semantics of Erlang and the translation?
Yes, because it seems that core Erlang has syntactic sugar, right? So there's some construction that could be written in some other way. So it's strange. And then regarding moving to concurrent core, so do you have some ideas how difficult this might be? Because moving from sequential to concurrent, it's not easy. You have some.
Yeah, this is a constant question during workshops and conferences to us, because we started with the sequential part, but we are not at the concurrent part yet. However, we also plan to, as I also mentioned in the video, we also plan to investigate some bisimulation approaches and these logical relations approaches, how we could scale these to concurrent part. But in my opinion, maybe bisimulations would be more effective for the concurrent part. Mm-hmm. But it's still future work, and we are planning to do planning to investigate program equivalence also in the concurrent part of core Erlang.
I think
And
it's a very interesting topic, so I like it a lot, and it was the same for me. I was working with sequential core Erlang first, and everyone asked, when are you moving to concurrent Erlang, right?
Yeah.
So I know your feeling. So if there are no more questions, I thank the speakers of the whole session again, and also Rafael and Carlos that have helped a lot. So thank you very much to everyone, and see you in half an hour for our keynote talk. Thank you.
Thank you.